Early 19th century. In the early 19th century, the American dream was deeply rooted in the idea of personal independence, self-sufficiency, and the opportunity to own land. This period was marked by the rapid expansion of the United States, both geographically and economically, as the country moved westward and settled on vast tracts of land. For many, the promise of a better life in America was closely tied to the opportunity to own land, establish a farm, and carve out a life for oneself away from the constraints of the European class system. During this period, land was seen as the primary means of achieving independence and economic prosperity. The availability of inexpensive or even free land in the Western territories played a central role in the American dream. For European settlers, the idea of owning land was not only a symbol of financial security, but also of freedom. In Europe, the land was typically owned by the nobility or the monarchy, and most peasants were dependent on landowners for their livelihoods. In contrast, the American frontier promised the possibility of anyone, regardless of social background, owning their own property and establishing a future based on their hard work and ingenuity. The Homestead Act of 1862, which offered 160 acres of land to settlers willing to cultivate it, epitomized this early American dream. Although it would be enacted later in the century, the seeds of this legislation were planted in the early 19th century as Americans were constantly pushing westward, driven by the idea that the nation's vast open spaces offered limitless opportunities. The notion that anyone could claim land and make it their own became synonymous with the American spirit. The American frontier during the early 19th century was a symbol of possibility, a place where a person could escape their past and start anew. The westward expansion offered people the chance to pursue a better life, away from the entrenched class systems of Europe. The rugged, untamed wilderness represented both a challenge and an opportunity. It was an open space where a man's success depended largely on his abilities, resourcefulness, and work ethic, rather than his social status or connections. The lure of the frontier was so powerful that it drew immigrants from all over the world. These new arrivals, many of whom had faced poverty and social restrictions in their home countries, saw the American frontier as a place where they could achieve a new level of freedom and possibility. The promise of land ownership was not just economic but symbolic of a life unburdened by the rigid social structures they had left behind. For these immigrants, the American dream was intimately connected to their ability to work the land and create a future that was theirs to control. Early American dream was fundamentally agrarian in nature. The idea of working the land to achieve success was central to this vision. Agrarianism, the belief in the virtue of rural life and farming, was a deeply ingrained value in the early years of the United States. Influential figures like Thomas Jefferson espoused the belief that a nation of independent farmers would be the cornerstone of American democracy. Jefferson, in particular, saw farming as a way to maintain individual freedom, free from the corrupting influences of urban life and industrialization. Farmers who worked their own land were seen as the bedrock of the country's independence and self-reliance. By cultivating the land, they were not only providing for their families, but also contributing to the growth and prosperity of the nation. For many Americans, owning and working the land represented both independence and an honorable way of life. The notion of self-sufficiency, being able to provide for one's family without relying on others, was a key part of the dream. The idea was that hard work on one's own land would lead to not just financial success, but also personal fulfillment and moral virtue. While the dream of land ownership and independence was enticing, it was not without its challenges. The reality of life on the frontier was harsh and unforgiving. Early settlers faced numerous obstacles, including difficult terrain, harsh weather conditions, scarce resources, and the threat of conflict with Native American tribes who were being displaced by the expanding frontier. The land may have been free, but the work required to tame it and make it productive was grueling and dangerous. Moreover, the ideal of land ownership as the path to prosperity was not equally accessible to all. Many Native Americans were forcibly removed from their lands through violent means, and enslaved African Americans were excluded from the dream of land ownership altogether. The systemic racism and colonial policies that existed in the early years of the Republic meant that while many immigrants and white settlers could aspire to own land and achieve independence, others were denied that opportunity by the laws and social structures of the time. The early 19th century also marked a time of significant political and cultural development in the United States. The idea of the American dream was shaped not only by economic opportunities but also by political ideologies. The Jacksonian era in particular championed the idea of democratic egalitarianism, arguing that the government should support the common man and provide him with the tools to succeed, whether through land or political participation. This period was marked by a growing belief that the government should play an active role in ensuring that all citizens, regardless of social class, had the opportunity to succeed. The rise of manifest destiny, the belief that the U.S. was destined to expand across the North American continent, also influenced the dream. It painted the idea of land acquisition as a divine right and duty, and this belief was used to justify the displacement of Native American tribes and the expansion into territories that would later become part of the United States. In the early 19th century, the American dream was a vision grounded in the values of independence, hard work, and the promise of land ownership. It was a dream that was intrinsically tied to the idea of opportunity, particularly the opportunity to own land and build a life free from the limitations of the old world. The dream was both a practical and symbolic aspiration, representing freedom, prosperity, and a new beginning for those willing to venture into the unknown. However, while it represented hope and opportunity for many, it was not without its contradictions. The benefits of land ownership and independence were often restricted by race, class, and geography. Nevertheless, the early 19th century set the stage for the evolution of the American dream, laying the groundwork for future generations to redefine and expand its meaning as the country grew and changed. Late 19th century. The late 19th century marked a pivotal shift in the American dream as the nation transformed from an agrarian economy to an industrial powerhouse. The expansion of railroads, the rise of large-scale factories, and the rapid urbanization of cities reshaped the landscape of opportunity and success in the United States. The dream of land ownership and rural independence gave way to a new vision, one centered around industrial labor, urban growth, and the pursuit of wealth through business and innovation. This period of transformation not only changed the economic fabric of America, but also altered the very nature of what it meant to be successful in the country. The late 19th century was a time of unprecedented economic growth driven by the Industrial Revolution. The development of new technologies, such as the steam engine, and the advent of mass production systems, such as the assembly line, allowed the United States to emerge as an industrial giant. Railroads, factories, and steel mills transformed the country's infrastructure, and cities across the country grew rapidly as people flocked to urban centers for employment. The American dream, during this period, began to reflect the rise of corporate America and the possibility of achieving wealth and success through industry. The wealth generated by industrialists like Andrew Carnegie, steel, John D. Rockefeller, oil, and Cornelius Vanderbilt, railroads, symbolized this new ideal of success. These men became icons of the American dream, embodying the belief that anyone, regardless of their background, could achieve extraordinary success by seizing opportunities in the expanding industrial economy. The rise of these captains of industry also highlighted the growing importance of entrepreneurship. The notion of individual success was now closely linked to business acumen, the ability to build and manage large enterprises, and the ambition to dominate entire industries. Wealth became the measure of success, and the American dream came to be defined by the idea that one could rise from humble beginnings to achieve immense fortune through innovation, perseverance, and strategic decision-making. With industrialization came the rapid growth of cities. The late 19th century saw the population of urban areas explode as millions of immigrants from Europe, as well as people from rural America, moved to cities in search of work. The promise of jobs in factories, mills, and warehouses transformed cities like New York, Chicago, Detroit, and Pittsburgh into bustling metropolises. This urban migration marked a dramatic shift in the American dream, moving it away from the open countryside and rural independence to the crowded streets and factories of urban centers. In these cities, the concept of the American dream became less about land and self-sufficiency and more about upward mobility through labor and employment. The factory floor became the new symbol of opportunity. Here, success was not tied to owning land or working independently, but to finding steady employment in an expanding economy and working one's way up through the ranks. The city also became the stage for the dream of social mobility, the idea that a person born into poverty could rise to the middle class or even achieve wealth and prominence through hard work and determination. While this was an ideal, it was increasingly difficult for many, particularly immigrants and laborers, to break out of the grueling low-wage work that defined the urban experience. Nevertheless, the urban environment represented the new frontier of opportunity, where individuals could still carve out a future for themselves, even if it meant working long hours in harsh conditions. The late 19th century was also marked by a massive influx of immigrants to the United States. Between 1880 and 1920, over 20 million immigrants came to America, many seeking a better life than what they had in their home countries. For these immigrants, the American dream was often synonymous with the hope of escaping poverty, political oppression, and social rigidity. The chance to start anew in America was seen as a pathway to freedom and opportunity. Upon arrival, many immigrants found themselves working in the rapidly expanding industrial sectors. They took on jobs in factories, steel mills, and slaughterhouses, often enduring grueling conditions for minimal pay. However, for many, these jobs represented the opportunity to earn a living, support their families, and eventually achieve a better life. The American dream in their eyes was not necessarily about instant wealth or fame, but about creating a stable, secure future through hard work. While the reality of their lives was often harsh, many immigrants believed that their children could achieve a better life through education and perseverance. The hope was that by securing a foothold in the industrial economy, future generations could rise into the middle class and enjoy the prosperity that seemed to await those who succeeded in the new urban industrial landscape. As industrialization progressed, the working conditions for laborers, both immigrant and native-born, became increasingly difficult. Long hours, dangerous work environments, and poor wages were the norm in factories, mines, and steel mills. The American dream of upward mobility through hard work seemed increasingly out of reach for many working-class individuals, leading to widespread labor unrest. The rise of labor unions and the struggle for workers' rights during this period was a direct response to the inequities created by industrial capitalism. Events such as the Haymarket Riot of 1886, the Pullman Strike of 1894, and the Homestead Strike of 1892 reflected the growing dissatisfaction of workers with the conditions they faced. These strikes and protests highlighted the fact that, for many, the American dream was not only about economic opportunity, but also about basic human dignity and the right to fair treatment. The struggles of the labor movement also led to the recognition that the American dream was not simply a matter of individual achievement, but also about the collective efforts of workers to improve their conditions and secure a better future for their families. The ideal of success began to shift as the growing gap between the wealthy elite and the working poor became more apparent. The late 19th century also saw the rise of what was known as the Gilded Age, a period of extreme wealth and poverty that was marked by corruption, political patronage, and a concentration of wealth in the hands of a few powerful individuals and corporations. While industrialists like Carnegie and Rockefeller amassed vast fortunes, many workers remained trapped in poverty. This period exposed the dark side of the American dream. While it promised that anyone could succeed through hard work, in reality, the opportunities for success were often limited by social class, access to education, and the monopolistic practices of powerful industries. The stark contrast between the lavish lifestyles of the wealthy elite and the grinding poverty of the working class led to the questioning of the dream itself. Was it truly attainable for all, or was it reserved for a select few? By the end of the 19th century, the American dream had evolved from a vision centered on land ownership and rural independence to one focused on industrial success, urban opportunity, and wealth accumulation through business and labor. While the industrial economy created unprecedented opportunities for some, it also highlighted deep inequities in the system. The dream was no longer just about owning land and building a farm, but about rising through the ranks of a rapidly growing economy dominated by factories, railroads, and large corporations. For many, the late 19th century version of the American dream was both a reflection of hope and a reflection of the harsh realities of the industrial age. The rise of corporate titans, the growth of urban centers, and the influx of immigrants created a new vision of success, but also underscored the struggles of those who found themselves on the bottom rungs of the economic ladder. This period marked the beginning of a more complex and multifaceted American dream, one that would continue to evolve throughout the 20th century. Early to mid-20th century. The early to mid-20th century marked the American dream's transition from a concept associated primarily with individual success and industrial growth to one that was more broadly accessible and linked to an expanding middle class. This era saw the consolidation of key social, political, and economic ideals, creating a shared vision of success centered around suburban life, home ownership, and job security. The rise of mass consumerism, coupled with the aftermath of World War II, set the stage for an era of unprecedented prosperity and social mobility, which for many Americans became the embodiment of the American dream. After World War II, the United States emerged as the world's leading economic and military power, entering a period of sustained economic growth and prosperity. The war had created massive demand for goods, and the post-war era saw an expansion of industry and technology, which allowed American workers to enjoy higher wages and a better standard of living. The economic boom that followed, often referred to as the golden age of capitalism, fueled the realization of the American dream for millions of families, especially those in the growing middle class. During this period, the country's gross domestic product, GDP, grew rapidly, and the unemployment rate remained low. Wages increased and job security was at an all-time high, giving Americans the sense that prosperity was within reach for those willing to work hard. The dream during this time was closely tied to the notion of stable, lifelong employment in well-paying industries, along with the ability to purchase a home, raise a family, and access education. The 1950s marked the beginning of a large-scale migration from cities to suburban neighborhoods, which became symbolic of the American dream. Suburbanization was fueled by factors such as the GI Bill, which provided financial assistance to returning veterans, including low-interest loans for home purchases, and the growing availability of automobiles, which made commuting to work in cities feasible. The development of the interstate highway system further accelerated suburban growth, making these areas increasingly accessible. For many, owning a home in the suburbs came to represent the ultimate achievement of the American dream. The suburban ideal was epitomized by the American dream house, a single-family home with a yard, often featuring a white picket fence, signifying both personal success and social stability. This vision was reinforced by cultural narratives in popular media, such as television shows like Leave It to Beaver and Father Knows Best, which portrayed suburban life as the epitome of happiness and fulfillment. Suburbia was also synonymous with family life during this period. The ideal family of the post-war era was often depicted as a middle-class, nuclear family consisting of a father who worked outside the home and a mother who stayed at home to raise children. This family model was closely tied to the growing expectations of prosperity, security, and social conformity, and it symbolized the dream of achieving a stable, fulfilling life through traditional middle-class values. As the economy boomed, so did consumer culture. The early to mid-20th century saw the rise of mass production and mass marketing, which made consumer goods like automobiles, household appliances, and televisions widely available to a broader swath of the population. With the emergence of large shopping malls and the expansion of retail chains like Walmart and Sears, Americans were able to indulge in a growing array of consumer products, which became symbolic of success. The concept of the material American dream took root during this period. The acquisition of goods and the ability to buy the latest consumer products became central to the idea of a successful life. Owning a new car, a big house, and the latest appliances were not only marks of personal achievement, but also symbols of belonging to the middle class and participating in the nation's prosperity. The post-war economy also saw a rise in advertising, which played a crucial role in shaping the desire for consumer goods. Companies targeted the aspirations of ordinary Americans, convincing them that buying a new car or a modern refrigerator was not just about convenience, but about living the American dream. Advertising created an aspirational culture, encouraging people to believe that they too could achieve the dream by purchasing the right products. Along with economic prosperity came a stronger emphasis on education as a means of social mobility. In the early to mid-20th century, education became more widely accessible, thanks in part to the GI Bill, which allowed veterans to attend college and contributed to a boom in higher education enrollment. This marked a shift in the American dream, as the idea of upward mobility through education began to take root. For many, the dream was no longer just about owning a home or having a good job, but about ensuring that their children could achieve a better standard of living through education and professional success. The expansion of public schools, community colleges, and universities made it possible for millions of Americans, particularly from working-class backgrounds, to pursue higher education. This allowed individuals to enter the growing professional fields, including medicine, law, engineering, and business, thus continuing the cycle of upward mobility. The dream was increasingly seen as a multi-generational pursuit, in which each new generation had the opportunity to achieve a higher standard of living through education and career advancement. While the early to mid-20th century marked a period of significant progress for many white Americans, it was also a time of struggle and upheaval for marginalized communities, particularly African Americans, who were excluded from the prosperity that the American dream promised. The civil rights movements of the 1950s and 1960s sought to challenge the racial inequalities that prevented Black Americans from fully realizing the dream. Leaders such as Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, and Malcolm X advocated for equal rights, voting rights, and an end to segregation, which were crucial to expanding the American dream to include all citizens, regardless of race. The famous 1963 March on Washington and King's "I Have a Dream" speech symbolized the growing demand for a more inclusive interpretation of the American dream, one that would allow African Americans and other minorities to achieve the same freedoms, opportunities, and prosperity that had previously been reserved for white Americans. The civil rights movement not only sought racial equality, but also aimed to redefine the American dream by challenging the deeply embedded racism that limited access to education, employment, and housing for people of color. By the mid-20th century, the dream was beginning to shift toward a more inclusive ideal, one that acknowledged the struggles of marginalized groups and the need for systemic changes to achieve true equality of opportunity. Alongside the economic boom and the expansion of civil rights, the American family began to evolve. While the traditional family model of a male breadwinner and a female homemaker remained dominant in the 1950s, the 1960s and 1970s saw the rise of new family structures, including single-parent households, dual-income families, and non-traditional living arrangements. This period also saw the emergence of women's liberation movements, which challenged traditional gender roles and expanded the opportunities for women to pursue careers, education, and economic independence. The growing participation of women in the workforce and their increased access to higher education marked another shift in the American dream, one that increasingly emphasized individual fulfillment and self-realization, not just economic success, through traditional roles. By the early to mid-20th century, the American dream had evolved into a widely accepted vision of prosperity and opportunity for the majority of Americans. It was defined by homeownership, stable employment, consumerism, and upward mobility through education. The post-World War II economic boom provided the backdrop for this dream, making it seem achievable for an entire generation. The era's social movements, from civil rights to women's liberation, sought to expand the dream's inclusivity, though it remained an ideal that was not easily accessible to all. For many, this era was the realization of the dream they had longed for, a symbol of the American promise of opportunity, freedom, and prosperity. However, this vision was not universally attainable, and the struggles for equality and social justice would continue to challenge the very definition of the American Dream in the coming decades. Despite the contradictions and limitations, the early to mid-20th century marked a period where the dream reached its fullest expression, becoming the mainstream vision of what it meant to be an American. Late 20th century. The late 20th century marked a significant shift in the American dream as it evolved in response to changing economic conditions, cultural values, and political landscapes. The period following the 1960s and 1970s saw a marked transformation in the national economy, with the decline of manufacturing, the rise of global competition, and the increasing influence of technology and finance. This era also witnessed the dismantling of traditional social structures, including the ideal of a stable, single-income household, and the growing embrace of individualism and personal freedom. As the dream continued to evolve, it became less about collective prosperity and more about personal achievement, often defined by material success, self-reliance, and the ability to break free from traditional societal norms. The late 20th century was marked by significant economic transitions that began in the 1970s and accelerated through the 1980s and 1990s. The once dominant industrial sector of the American economy began to decline as manufacturing jobs were outsourced to countries with cheaper labor, and technological advancements, particularly in automation and computers, reduced the demand for traditional factory work. This shift is often referred to as deindustrialization, and it had a profound impact on communities that had previously relied on manufacturing jobs for economic stability. For many Americans, this represented a decline of the traditional American dream, a vision tied to stable, unionized, and well-paying jobs in industries like steel, textiles, and automobiles. As large factories closed or moved overseas, many workers found themselves displaced, struggling to adapt to an economy increasingly defined by service and technology industries. While the information age promised new opportunities in sectors like finance, computing, and tech, these jobs often required specialized skills and higher levels of education, which left large segments of the population behind. The globalization of trade and the rise of the financial sector also contributed to the changing nature of the American dream. The U.S. economy became increasingly reliant on international trade and financial markets, with industries such as technology, banking, and real estate becoming central to economic growth. While some Americans were able to benefit from these new sectors, many found themselves struggling with job insecurity, wage stagnation, and an increasing wealth gap. While suburbanization had been synonymous with the American dream in the 1950s and 1960s, the late 20th century saw suburbs becoming less of an ideal and more of a symbol of discontent. As the economy shifted, many families found themselves burdened by rising housing costs, high interest rates, and the growing gap between rich and poor. The idea of home ownership as a cornerstone of the American dream was increasingly out of reach for many, particularly in urban areas where the cost of living and housing prices surged. In the 1980s, home ownership became increasingly tied to the speculative real estate market, which saw soaring housing prices and widespread mortgage deregulation. The dream of buying a home became more a matter of financial speculation than of securing long-term stability. In fact, this speculative housing market contributed to the financial crisis of 2008, which exposed the fragility of the dream for millions of Americans who had invested in homes they could not afford. For many, the idea of suburban stability was undermined by the volatility of housing markets, leading to an erosion of confidence in the dream of home ownership as a symbol of success. Moreover, suburbia became increasingly associated with social fragmentation and racial inequality. The idea that suburban life represented a perfect, happy existence was challenged by growing concerns over the racial and economic segregation of suburban communities. Many suburban areas became racially homogeneous, and systemic inequalities in education, housing, and employment began to perpetuate cycles of poverty in both urban and suburban areas. The prosperity promised by suburban life seemed increasingly unattainable for minorities, and the American dream became more divisive. The 1970s and 1980s witnessed the rise of an increasingly individualistic cultural ethos, marked by a focus on personal freedom, self-actualization, and the pursuit of individual desires over collective well-being. This shift was reflective of broader cultural changes, including the breakdown of traditional family structures, the rise of feminist and civil rights movements, and the growing popularity of new forms of spirituality and self-help. The notion of the American dream became more centered on personal achievement and self-expression than ever before. This was a time when the me generation, as it was sometimes called, embraced the pursuit of personal fulfillment and success, as defined by wealth, fame, and individual recognition. The rise of celebrity culture, reality TV, and the glamorization of self-made millionaires in industries like entertainment, technology, and fashion reinforced the idea that the dream was achievable for anyone who could capitalize on their talents or personal brand. This new vision of success emphasized personal ambition, often at the expense of community-based goals or societal obligations. The growth of personal finance as a field also contributed to the rise of individualism in the American dream. More people began to see success not as the result of hard work within a traditional, stable job, but as something that could be achieved through entrepreneurship, financial investment, and individual business ventures. Self-made millionaires like Steve Jobs and Oprah Winfrey became icons of the new dream, symbolizing a vision of success in which anyone could start from nothing and build a fortune. The late 20th century also marked significant changes in the roles of women in American society, as feminist movements in the 1960s and 1970s helped dismantle some of the traditional gender roles that had long defined the American dream. The dream for women had once been confined to domesticity and child-rearing, but by the 1980s and 1990s, women were increasingly pursuing careers, higher education, and personal fulfillment outside the home. As the workforce opened up to women, the dream expanded beyond the confines of marriage and motherhood to include professional success, independence, and self-sufficiency. Women entrepreneurs, business executives, and politicians began to emerge as new symbols of the American dream, demonstrating that women too could achieve financial independence, break through corporate glass ceilings, and lead at the highest levels of society. The feminist movement continued to challenge gender norms, advocating for equal pay, reproductive rights, and greater representation in positions of power. The changing role of women was not only a redefinition of gender roles, but also a transformation of the American dream itself, one that encouraged women to seek fulfillment through professional success, education, and independence, not just through marriage and motherhood. Along with the rise of individualism and the expansion of opportunities for women, the late 20th century also saw the American dream slowly begin to open up for minorities. Although the struggle for racial and ethnic equality continued, the civil rights movement, the American Indian movement, and the Chicano movement had already begun challenging the racial inequalities inherent in the American dream. But it was not until the 1980s and 1990s that a more visible shift began to take place. The affirmative action policies of the 1970s and 1980s aimed to increase minority representation in higher education and the workforce, allowing for greater access to the American dream for people of color. Barack Obama's rise to political prominence and the increased visibility of minorities in politics, entertainment, and business highlighted a growing recognition that the American dream was no longer confined to white, middle-class Americans. Yet, despite these advances, many communities of color still faced systemic inequalities in education, employment, and housing, which made it difficult for them to fully participate in the dream. The late 20th century marked a period of immense change for the American dream. The decline of manufacturing, the rise of individualism, and the increasing focus on consumerism and personal success transformed the dream into a more fragmented and individualized concept. While the dream remained deeply tied to the pursuit of economic success, personal fulfillment, and social mobility, it had become clear that achieving the dream was no longer a simple matter of hard work and perseverance. Economic shifts, the rise of global competition, and growing inequality made the dream more elusive for many Americans. The American dream had also evolved into a symbol of personal achievement and individual freedom, no longer solely focused on traditional notions of family life, suburban homeownership, or stable, lifelong employment. For many, the dream became increasingly about self-reliance, personal expression, and the ability to break free from traditional social structures. At the same time, the dream expanded to include more women and minorities, though significant barriers remained. As the century drew to a close, the American dream had become a complex and multifaceted ideal, one that continued to inspire people but was increasingly difficult to attain for large segments of the population. In the coming years, the American dream would be further redefined by the challenges of the 21st century, but the struggles and transformations of the late 20th century laid the groundwork for this ongoing evolution. First century. As we entered the 21st century, the American dream entered a new phase of evolution, one that reflected deepening economic, social, and cultural challenges. The globalized economy, rapid technological advances, and increasing political polarization reshaped the ways in which Americans viewed success, opportunity, and prosperity. The promise of upward mobility, which had been central to the American dream for much of the 20th century, was increasingly questioned as systemic inequalities, job insecurity, and rising costs of living began to expose the fragility of the dream for many. While the American dream continued to symbolize the potential for individual success, it also became increasingly associated with an ideal that seemed increasingly unattainable for many Americans, particularly younger generations and those in marginalized communities. The crisis of the American dream in the 21st century is marked by a tension between idealism and realism, as the social, political, and economic realities of the modern world present obstacles that were not fully envisioned by earlier generations. One of the most significant developments in the 21st century regarding the American dream has been the growing economic inequality between the wealthiest Americans and the rest of the population. While the top 1% of earners in the U.S. have seen significant increases in their wealth, the vast majority of Americans have experienced stagnant wages, underemployment, and rising living costs. According to various studies, wealth inequality in the U.S. has reached historic levels, with the richest Americans owning a disproportionate share of the country's wealth, while many others are struggling to keep up. The American dream, which once promised that hard work and perseverance could lead to financial success, is increasingly viewed as a myth by younger generations, who face daunting challenges in securing stable, well-paying jobs and building long-term financial security. Student loan debt, housing costs, and job insecurity are among the major barriers that young Americans face in achieving the traditional markers of success, such as homeownership and career stability. The rise of the gig economy, which includes freelance, temporary, or part-time work, has also contributed to the instability of the modern workforce. Many young people, in particular, are unable to access the stable, full-time jobs that were once the foundation of the American dream. Instead, they work in low-wage, unpredictable jobs that do not offer benefits such as health insurance, retirement savings, or paid leave. This economic precarity has led to widespread anxiety about the future, with many people questioning whether the dream of upward mobility is still possible for those who are not born into wealth. Owning a home has long been a central tenet of the American dream, symbolizing not just economic success but also a sense of stability, security, and belonging. However, in the 21st century, homeownership has become increasingly out of reach for many Americans, particularly in major cities, where housing prices have soared. The housing crisis that began in the mid-2000s, culminating in the 2008 financial collapse, exposed the fragility of the housing market and the dangers of speculative investment in real estate. In the wake of the crisis, millions of Americans lost their homes, and many others found themselves trapped in homes that had lost value or were underwater with mortgages, far exceeding the worth of the property. While the housing market has since recovered, the dream of owning a home is increasingly difficult for younger generations, who face high student loan debt, rising rental costs, and a lack of stable, well-paying jobs. In many cities, the cost of housing has outpaced wage growth, leaving many Americans unable to afford even modest homes. The growing wealth gap and the concentration of property ownership in the hands of a few wealthy investors have further eroded the possibility of home ownership. For many, the notion of the American dream as a pathway to stable home ownership has become an aspiration for many, but an unattainable reality for others. the decline of traditional stable jobs with benefits, which had once been central to the American dream, is another key shift in the 21st century. Globalization, automation, and the increasing use of technology have led to the loss of many well-paying manufacturing jobs and the rise of service sector and technology-based jobs. While these new jobs may offer opportunities for some, they are often characterized by contract work, part-time employment, or freelance arrangements, which provide little to no job security or benefits like health care, retirement, or paid leave. In industries where traditional job security was once a guarantee, such as manufacturing, retail, and transportation, many Americans now face the prospect of constant job turnover, wage stagnation, and a lack of career advancement. The rise of the gig economy, in which people work for companies like Uber, Lyft, and Airbnb on a temporary or per-project basis, has compounded these issues. While gig work provides flexibility, it also means that workers have less control over their earnings and working conditions, often facing a lack of benefits and protections that were once standard in full-time employment. This shift in the nature of work has undermined the traditional idea that hard work will lead to stable employment and a comfortable life. Instead, Americans increasingly face a future in which job insecurity and precarious work are the norm, making it harder to build the kind of stable career and family life that were once central to the dream. Education has long been seen as the key to unlocking the American dream. The idea that anyone could attend college, get a degree, and improve their life prospects was central to the dream for much of the 20th century. However, in the 21st century, the rising costs of education have made it increasingly difficult for students to achieve upward mobility through higher education. Student loan debt has become a significant burden for many young Americans, with outstanding student loans surpassing $1.7 trillion in recent years. Many graduates enter the workforce with significant debt that takes years, if not decades, to pay off. As a result, young people who are burdened with debt are finding it difficult to purchase homes, save for the future, or invest in their careers. Moreover, the high cost of education has created a barrier to entry for lower-income families, making the dream of upward mobility through education more difficult to achieve. While some people are able to attend college on scholarships or through financial aid, the rising cost of tuition has priced many students out of higher education or forced them to take on large amounts of debt. This has led to a generation of young people questioning whether the dream of education as a path to success is still achievable. Instead of seeing education as a stepping stone to a better life, many now see it as a financial burden that traps them in cycles of debt and economic uncertainty. In the 21st century, political polarization has further complicated the American dream, with deep divides between different groups regarding how the country should address issues like healthcare, taxes, education, and social welfare. The increasing influence of special interest groups, corporate lobbying, and partisan media has created a fragmented political landscape in which the pursuit of a shared, unified American dream has become more difficult. For many Americans, the dream of prosperity and success is now entangled in a political struggle, with some advocating for more government intervention in the economy, and others calling for less regulation and more individual responsibility. The culture wars over issues like race, gender, immigration, and economic inequality have divided the country, making it harder to rally around a common vision of success. In this context, the American dream has become a divisive ideal, with some viewing it as a path to individual liberty and prosperity, and others seeing it as an unjust system that rewards the wealthy while leaving the rest behind. While the American dream in its traditional form faces significant challenges in the 21st century, there are signs of a new, more inclusive and sustainable vision of success emerging. Increasingly, younger generations are pushing for a reimagined dream, one that emphasizes social justice, environmental sustainability, and economic equality. This evolving vision of the dream is more focused on collective well-being, with an emphasis on creating opportunities for all Americans, regardless of race, gender, or socioeconomic background. Social movements like Black Lives Matter, climate change activism, and the push for universal health care are challenging the notion that success should be defined solely by individual wealth and personal achievement. Instead, the American dream is becoming a more communal vision of prosperity, one that values shared opportunity, economic justice, and environmental stewardship. In this new iteration of the dream, the focus is not only on economic success, but also on creating a society that is equitable and sustainable, where the pursuit of happiness and fulfillment is balanced with the collective responsibility to future generations. This new version of the American dream might be more difficult to attain in the traditional sense, but it offers a broader and more inclusive vision of what it means to live a successful life in the 21st century. The American dream in the 21st century is at a crossroads. The traditional markers of success, home ownership, stable employment, and upward mobility through education, are increasingly difficult for many Americans to achieve. Economic inequality, the decline of job security, the housing crisis, and the burden of student loan debt have exposed the cracks in the dream and created new obstacles for those trying to climb the ladder of success. However, the dream is not dead. It is evolving in response to the challenges of the modern world, with a growing emphasis on social equity, sustainability, and individual fulfillment. As the nation grapples with these challenges, the question remains, what does the American dream mean in the 21st century, and how can it be transformed to reflect the needs and aspirations of all Americans? While the dream may no longer be the same as it once was, it continues to serve as a symbol of hope, resilience, and the pursuit of a better life, even as the path to that dream becomes more complex and uncertain.